there's a major message in our culture that says your body's not trustworthy because it's the wrong size, because it doesn't know how to handle food, because our food system's corrupt. There's all these things that are thrown at us where all of a sudden you combine a little bit of insecurity with your body's not trustworthy. Now we have a disordered relationship with food because now we don't know how to handle food. And we either cling to it by either overeating it or we avoid it where we don't want to learn anything about it. It's too stressful, or we try to control it.
Hi, I'm Blake Schofield, founder and CEO of The Bridge to Fulfillment. Mom to 3, USA Today top 10 professional coach, and former corporate executive who got tired of sacrificing my life for a comfortable paycheck. My mission is to expand perspectives to achieve greater impact at home and work without sacrifice. This is The Bridge to Fulfillment. On today's episode of The Bridge to Fulfillment, I'm welcoming guest expert Jessika Brown. She's a registered dietitian with her master's degree in nutrition and a certified specialist in sports dietetics and a certified eating disorders registered dietitian and supervisor. Her superpower is helping people live deeper in their values through health. Jess teaches nutrition using the empowered eating method, which consists of biofeedback and science-supported nutrition that is fueled by your values. Her mission is to uncomplicate food by building body trust. She loves to teach women how to become strong and confident in their own bodies with a balance of grit, grace, and glucose. Jess knows you have an inner awesome, and it's time your health hang-ups stop eclipsing that awesome from blessing the world. I can tell you this was such a fun conversation. No matter where you are in your nutrition or health journey, we all have an opportunity to better understand the values and belief systems, how our emotions are tied to food, and how we can continue to improve our health for ourselves and for those that we love. And I'm really excited to dive in and really allow you the opportunity to hear some universal truths that Jess and I share together that have fundamentally improved our lives and our clients' lives. And I hope that they will improve yours as well. Welcome to The Bridge to Fulfillment, Jess. It's so great to have you.
Thank you so much for having me on, Blake. I'm excited to be here.
Oh, I'm so happy to have you. One of the reasons I was excited to bring you on the show is, for me, what I've really realized in my own personal journey is that so many of the conventional wisdom or methodologies that we're taught are really broken. And as a society, we are seeking all these things that are ultimately Band-Aids that don't give us the results or the solutions we need. And we often then think that there's something wrong with us. And so I really love to bring guests on who have discovered and found their own approaches through their journey that have been impactful and are helping impact other people. And nutrition is an area for me several years ago that I invested in that really made such a huge difference on my energy levels, how I felt, solved so many problems I didn't even really know I had or were possible, helped me understand how broken what we're teaching is about our food systems, our processed food, and how so much of that is actually killing us or creating all of the disease that we're struggling with. And so I love hearing more in that realm, but I was also fascinated because of your experience in biofeedback. And I also went through biofeedback when I was young. And so we haven't talked about it yet, but I'm hoping we'll have an opportunity to speak about how that came together because it intrigued me. And I think far too many people don't even know what that is, even though at this point it's been around for decades. And so I was like, oh, fascinating. Let's talk about it. So with that said, I'm excited for what will come in this conversation, but why don't we start with just having you introduce yourself, share with us a little bit about you, and how did you end up in the journey that you're on today?
Totally. Well, thank you for that. And yeah, I love how you highlight biofeedback because it's funny. It's like a buzzword now where it's really not a new word, right? But we'll get into that here in a bit. Yeah. So thank you for that introduction. My name is Jess. So I'm a registered dietitian. Professionally, I have been working as a dietitian for, what am I on? 13 or 14 years. You start to once I hit a decade, I stopped counting, And so I actually started my career, went back to school with the intention of working with people with eating disorders. And like most people who go into that field, I was struggling with an eating disorder prior to going back to school. So I really battled with like body image, the emotional side of food, and went back to school to become a dietitian with the intention to better understand myself and therefore then serve others. So I spent the bulk of my career learning and understanding, the things we don't say out loud and how we can manifest that out through our food actions or how we take care of our body or don't take care of our body. And back up, before I went to school, before I learned about nutrition, before any of that, just found myself in this space where I think our culture tells us, a lot about how to treat our bodies, what our bodies should look like. There's a lot of conflicting information on how we should care for and feed our bodies. And I was really lost in all of that, really, really lost in it. And I think that's where I found myself so confused by it and really in a space of just like lack of knowledge combined with our cultural pressure to look a certain way and developed a disorder. So long story short, I went to school, did a lot of spiritual healing and came back to my faith, which was a huge part of my story, and just genuinely fell in love with how intricately designed our bodies are and how our bodies connect with fuel in such amazing ways. And I couldn't I couldn't unlearn all the things I learned in school. And so I did end up going into the career field of supporting individuals with eating disorders. I worked in inpatient treatment centers and an outpatient treatment center and really lived in there. And, the really cool part about working in that world, Blake, is you see just how emotional food is for all of us. And I think, whether you've had an eating disorder or not, a very small percentage of the population is actually diagnosed with an eating disorder. But I think at some level, so many people can relate to like the stuff behind food, whether it's using food as a coping tool to soothe stress or avoiding it because we don't know how to deal with it. And we really label it as good or bad. And it becomes a moral compass. Like we put so much emotion into it that we lose, the actual physical powers food can give to us. So I spent the bulk of my career there. And then actually in the last 5 to 8 years, started transitioning more to sports nutrition and became a certified sports specialist. And what was cool about this is sports nutrition it's very scientific and linear. It's very you need this much protein before you do this much work and this much carbohydrate. And I thought it was really cool to live in both of those worlds, to look at the emotional side of food and then start to see how the science side could be so powerful. So now what I do is I work to combine those two worlds. And I teach something called empowered eating, which is balancing both of those. But how do we balance the emotional side of us and what we value and what's important to us? And how does that actually play into our health journey? And how do we bring in the cool stuff about nutrition? How do we actually learn how to fuel our body in a way that is productive and supports the lifestyle and the kind of energy we want to bring? And then the third piece of my model that I teach is the biofeedback, which is just that connection point with your actual body. And I think that's really the piece that brings it all together. Because we can know what we want to do and how we want to take care of our bodies, and we can know what the books say we should do. But at the end of the day, it's truly that connection with our physical body. And what does our body say about food? What was your energy after you ate? So I feel really blessed to be where I'm at because really my whole journey through the actual eating disorder and healing my own relationship with food and sitting with other people that have struggled, now getting to do some more macro and micronutrient calculations, it's just kind of all come together and something I feel I'm really passionate about because it's fun. It's fun to help people figure this stuff out. So that's the short story of where I got and how I'm here.
I love it. And there's so much to dig into. I guess I'll start with this and then maybe a couple of questions. When I was 7 years old, I felt this very heavy calling on my life. I knew that the way I saw the world was different. And I've spent almost 40 years really trying to piece together and understand, why are we here? What's our purpose? And what are all of the places of which we are lost or seeking band-aids? And consistently, what I really have come to see is that it's that old quote, all problems are psychological, all solutions are spiritual. That at the core root of who we are as human beings, and the biggest challenges that we all have, are lack of connection to God, and therefore lack of connection to ourselves and others. And when I hear you talk about your experience as a young child, right, as a teen growing up, where you developed an eating disorder, it is the same thing I consistently see, which is when we lack that connection and we lack that inherent worth and value and trust, we will either, and we don't know how to process our emotions, which society doesn't really teach us, we will either cling to, avoid, or attempt to control. And I think what so many people don't understand about food is that emotional component is we're using that emotional component in food. Are you avoiding, what you're dealing with? And so you're going out and eating. Are you controlling? And that might be an eating disorder. It might be, on the other hand, like the extreme. I have to measure absolutely everything. And I'm so measured about it that I don't allow any flexibility. I have a real passion and a heart for this because I think, when I was in corporate America, I spent 16 years as a merchant, and I ended up becoming really known for being a merchant in plus sizes, which people were often shocked because I'm like size 4. And what am I doing buying plus size clothing? But I came to understand the challenges of what it's like for somebody to be plus sized in our world, and the amount of judgment, lack of resources, assumptions. And I think that we have the same on the flip side, people that suffer from anorexia, bulimia. And then we have the rest of the world sort of sitting in the middle. But if we can begin to have compassion and understand the root cause of all of these things, we can understand that none of us are different or separated. This is the human condition. And until we learn and understand that every emotion we feel is for us, and that we create our own suffering around it, we can't create any change. And so I'm excited to sort of dive in this with you because, not only do I have many friends that have struggled with their weight and their health for, their whole life and have suffered tremendously from that because there's a lot of judgment in that realm. My daughter, when she was 12 or 13, was on a dance team, and there was a girl on her team who became anorexic. And I never thought that my young daughter would have to deal with or understand the mental health struggle that surrounded that. Unfortunately, that girl, Julie, ended up committing suicide. And it was absolutely devastating for my daughter, devastating for me. And so I hope today, as we kind of open up these conversations about health and how we look at food, that we can also open up compassion for the human condition around it. Because like I said, whether you're on an extreme on either ends, we all suffer from it in one way or another. Some of us might choose to be workaholics. Some of us might choose to control our food. Some of us might turn to other things. But the reality is it all goes back to that root and not really feeling whole and not knowing how to process what we're experiencing. So I just share that. And thank you for coming on to open up the conversation. Right, we're talking about health, we're talking about food, but there's a link with that, with mental health. And I think when we can open up the conversation in a more holistic way, it can help give people grace and compassion for themselves and others.
So good. So good. Yeah. First of all, I'm so sorry to hear that about the girl on the dance team. That's why we're here having these conversations in hopes that cycle doesn't continue. And, in the realm I've chosen to pursue helping people has been in the realm where people do decide to take it out on their bodies or get sucked into taking it out on their bodies. But I think you're so right. It's this inability to understand what we're feeling and a lack of tolerance for distress, right? It's almost like there's this illusion that we're supposed to never feel sad or upset. And, if we do, we need to get rid of the feeling. And that's one of the biggest things I've taken away from working with this population and in my own healing is that that is part of the human experience. We have to get rid of this lie that it's going to be wonderful and beautiful all the time. No, half, if not more, of the human experience is sorrow and sadness and developing resiliency through those pieces. You had mentioned we cling to, and I can't remember the second part, or control.
Avoid or control.
Cling to, avoid, or control. And in the work I do, I see that to be so true. And so just in the context of, food and how we interact with food, when we go through a hard time or we feel distressed, or maybe we feel a little insecure. And in my case, it was being a teenage girl, just a typical teenage girl, a little insecure, had a rough boyfriend that wasn't super encouraging. It wasn't anything catastrophic that happened to me, but it was like this perfect storm. And then I believe there's a major message in our culture that says your body's not trustworthy because it's the wrong size, because it doesn't know how to handle food, because our food system's corrupt. There's all these things that are thrown at us where all of a sudden you combine a little bit of insecurity with your body's not trustworthy. Now we have a disordered relationship with food because now we don't know how to handle food. And we either cling to it by either overeating it, or we avoid it where we don't want to learn anything about it. It's too stressful, or we try to control it. And that's probably the more extreme case that we see in eating disorder world. But I think you're right. Like at some point we can all relate to one of those three coping tools.
Mm-hmm. Well, what you're saying, I also see to be so true, which is I've really come to understand the body as the shortcut. When you learn how to listen to your body, you can develop that self-trust. It's how you develop your inner compass. And absolutely, not only were we not taught how to listen to our bodies, we often as children are told that we are too emotional, or that the way that we do things isn't right, or we should be a certain way. And so very early on in society, we start taking and stripping away the uniqueness of who we are and our own inner compass, and we start replacing it with the teacher knows better, the parent knows better, there must be something wrong with me. And again, I see this so much as a human condition issue. And the reason I'm kind of going into this initially is because I think this impacts all of us in ways that until you get to a point where you really spend the time to be self-aware, you don't know, right? Because I would venture to bet there was also something going on in your home, in addition to being a teenager, in addition to not listening to your voice, that created a perception that maybe food was the place to solve that problem. No, because I actually came from a beautiful home. And I think what it actually was, my disorder really started to develop into college. And when there was a disruption in what was predictable. So it was less about I was very fortunate. I did not experience any trauma. I came from a very solid foundation, good family unit. It was truly just like the lack of predictability in my life. All of a sudden I went to school totally by myself and didn't know anyone, right? Like I didn't know what was next. And life has really big questions when you go to college. It's like, what are you going to major in? What are you going to do with your life? What's next? And I just honestly wasn't prepared to answer those. And so I thought it would be easier to focus on fixing my body than it would be to focus on, what I was going to do with my life, because at least my body I could control, right? There's that control again. Yeah. And what that tells me is, and again, this is a place where there's never any judgment. You can grow up in the best home and still have little T trauma.
Totally.
So what that tells me is you grew up in an environment that was very safe, structured, and reliable, which means you never learned the skills to challenge yourself, deal with uncertainty, or didn't learn what's the ultimate source of safety. And I think most of us don't, right? Mm-hmm. And sometimes as parents, we try to create such a safe environment for our kids that we actually do things that hurt them in ways that we can't even maybe know. For me, a huge part of my security and identity was around helping and saving people. My parents divorced when I was young, and I became the person that made sure everybody was okay. Mm-hmm. And then a huge part of my identity became around that I was successful in my job. And those were the places I attempted to control everything. Yeah. And then when those things started to crumble, my life crumbled. And the reality is that we all do that. We all build an identity based around something. And if we don't have or haven't been taught, and most of us haven't, because these are skills and tools that our parents and our grandparents did not have. It's not a slight to them. They just didn't have them. Right. And when that moment comes when we don't know how to deal with uncertainty, or the way of which we've built the foundation of our life crumbles, we don't know what to do. And so I share that as an overarching piece because I see it consistently, and it is the human condition. And also, I think it's a great segue for us to talk about that in terms of nutrition, in terms of food, because like I said, whether you have an extreme version of this or not, we all have some sort of opportunity to understand nutrition at a more integral level. Like I said, several years ago, when I ended up going into a friend's program, I was blown away by what I learned. Often I look back and think, hey, they were actually teaching me good stuff in school that I had no interest in and didn't pay any attention to. And now I wish that I did. And I think, at least for my generation, there used to be this perspective, go to school, get a job, and then you're done. But the reality is the speed of the world is moving so fast. We must become lifelong learners. And that's really what it's about. And so for today, I think it's a great opportunity, no matter where you are on the spectrum about food. And even if you think you have a healthy perspective about food, I would encourage you to listen in, because there's probably something you can learn to improve your health, the way that you feel, and or improve it for somebody else that you love. So Jess, let me ask you, if you had only 2 or 3 things you could tell somebody that you think are the most important things for them to understand their health and nutrition, what would they be?
Ooh, that's a good one. The first one, I have to think kind of holistically. The first one is we have to define health on our own terms, not off the doctor's terms, off culture's terms, off how we were raised. Like, we have to get very clear on what healthy looks like for us specifically. So how I like to do that with the folks I work with and support is I work in the values work. I like to identify what our top 3 to 5 values are and how that supports you, or how your health plays into those values. So for example, one of my values is impact. And I like to have an impact, whether that's in my home on a Friday night, or in the workplace and what I'm doing with my career. But the reality is, in order for me to have the energy to show up and be the kind of person that can make the impact I want to make, I have to have a good night's sleep for the most part. That's changed a little bit since becoming a mom. I have to be well rested. I have to be well fed. Like, I have to take care of my body physically. And I have more energy when I move my body. And so learning how to identify, this is what I value. This is what's most important to me. This is like me at my healthiest self, thinking in bigger picture than just my weight or my lab work. Like, we want to think holistically there. And then how does my health actually support that? So that's number one, because I would say we have to figure out your values and how your health plays into that. More tactically speaking, on the nutrition side, the second piece I would look at is in the realm of biofeedback, and that's our gut health. Our gut health is so powerful for many reasons. One, it's one of our first lines of defense against any foreign anything within our body. Like, if you think of food entering into your mouth and you swallow it, it goes into your body. It doesn't actually transition into your body until it passes through your GI system, until it gets into your intestines, moves through your microbiome, which is the layer that lines your intestines, and then into your body through your bloodstream. So our microbiome is that bacterial layer, that bacterial lining in our gut, and it has a huge influence on our mental health, on our immune system, and how we digest food and how we process everything we eat. So I think looking at gut health would be the second thing I would encourage people to learn more about and get connected to and understand what's happening within your body.
So good. I've heard so much about gut health the last decade, and there's a lot of products and a lot of perspectives about that. And I always am skeptical when I see people say, take this drink and it's going to solve your problem and you can eat all this crap that's horrible for you. So I'm interested to know your perspective on that. What do you think is the common conventional wisdom around it, and what's the real truth?
When we think of our microbiome, so again, for those that haven't heard of this, or this is new, microbiome is just the fancy word for your bacterial lining within your gut. Everybody has it, and it's like a fingerprint. Everybody's is different. one of the cool things that it does is it communicates to your brain through the vagus nerve. And you're going to communicate different messages depending on what kind of condition your microbiome is. So if you've got a dense and diverse microbiome, meaning we have lots of variety in bacteria in your gut and it's really dense, there's going to be like this beautiful tune that is sent through your vagus nerve up to your brain. And I think of it like, pick your favorite genre of music constantly being played in the background of your brain. That's what your microbiome can do. Now, when it's off, we have the opposite. Like think of the genre you don't like being constantly played to your brain. And when that happens, that's when we can see things show up like amplified anxiety. So they don't believe gut dysbiosis causes anxiety, but it can amplify anxiety. We see it show up in, I call it the poop report. So if your bowels are really loose or you're constipated, like that's an indicator that something is off. We also see it in like hair loss, skin conditions. It can be connected to certain autoimmune diseases. So this is how it's going to actually physically show up within your body. So if you have some of those alarms going off, one of the best ways to work through that and heal it is check some of the basics. And I think so many people are like jump to the probiotics or jump to the supplement before checking some of the basics. And those basics are making sure we're getting enough fluid. Like we have to be hydrated. Our cells need water to process the foods we eat. Getting adequate fiber. This is so funny because it's like not new news. It's not sparkly. We have to eat fruits and vegetables. But the research shows when the USDA surveyed Americans, 60% are not eating adequate fruits and veggies. So we have to up that. The goal is 5 to 9 servings or 5 to 9 cups of fruits and veggies a day, which do you eat 5 to 9 servings of fruits and veggies, Blake?
I'd say probably 4 or 5.
Yeah. I do this for a living and I have to work really hard to get to 5. But it's a hard thing to do. Yep. So I say this with like a lot of grace because while it's the goal, it's not easy. And it sounds simple, but it's not easy. But this would be one of the first steps to take is eating adequate fiber. If you find you have a really sensitive gut and that actually increases, because sometimes the extra fiber can amplify if you have loose stool or diarrhea. One of the things you can do is cook your veggies and work up to that 5 to 9 and having softer, more easily digested veggies. So working towards the fiber would be another step. I do think there are some benefits in some supplements out there. They do provide some gut healing if people are struggling with a gut dysbiosis and we don't get adequate amounts in our diet in general. And that would be zinc and magnesium. Zinc and magnesium are 2 supplements that are tough to get and they can be quite healing. So again, it's going to depend. I have to say this disclaimer. Of course, you want to talk with your healthcare provider, before adding any supplements, but looking at those 2 and pulling them into your daily routine can be quite healing. So we got fiber, we got fluid, and we've got putting in some gut healing supplements.
And since most people are not drinking enough water, what do you recommend? What's the recommended amount of water you should be drinking?
So I actually don't prescribe amounts. I use biofeedback. So I recommend drinking until your urine is lightly colored or not pigmented at all. And it's so funny, Blake, I have my kids trained on this, where they will literally come running out of the bathroom and my boys will say things like, Mama, my pee is not clear. I need some water. And I love that. And so I think if we as adults need to do the same thing. I mean, get your favorite water bottle. I've got my very basic girl Stanley cup sitting next to me, but get a water bottle that you love and drink it until your biofeedback says we have enough. We are adequately hydrated.
I love it. Yeah. I use biofeedback for migraine tension headaches, but it's amazing, right? To your point, all of the ways in which it can be used. And really the intent is to be able to understand and control more of what's happening in your body. And at 12, I had no idea what a huge benefit that was to me to start to develop a greater sense of connection with my body. Most of us are really disconnected. And I also think that disconnection often can be tied to food. Like before I learned how to eat healthy, to your point, I eat probably 5 servings of fruits and veggies, but I eat a lot of greens. a lot of greens on a day-to-day basis. So I get a lot of the zinc and magnesium and all of that, which fundamentally changed my entire levels of energy, how I feel, like all of it. But before I started eating healthy, my stomach would often hurt after I ate. And I thought that was because I was full. And I had no idea it was actually my body rejecting the food, the additives, the preservatives, all of the stuff that was going on, because I just grew up where it was like, well, if your stomach hurts after you eat, then you must be full.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's so much of that where we just don't even know our own bodies and how they respond and what they're telling us. And it was through my own health journey when I got rid of all of that. And I was like, oh, I'm full, but I don't feel full. I have 2 to 3 hours more energy a day, and I didn't even know I could feel this way. And then the occasional time when I would eat something that my body really did not like. And then it was like, oh, it does not like this at all. And that's how I used to feel. And it wasn't that I was full. It was that actual thing that I was eating. And so I love the message that you're giving here, which is stop looking at things as a one size fits all, which I think is really broken in so much of our society, is we think we're average or we should be average. And then we get upset that we're not. And we're trying to solve problems based on averages that may not actually solve the root cause problems of the ones we have. And learn to trust and listen to yourself that your body's giving you signals that are telling you it's okay or not okay. And what do you do with that then and correct from there?
So good. Yeah, so good.
Let's see. What else might we talk about? Because this is so good. Kids, I'd love to hear this. How old are your boys?
They are 7 and 9.
Okay, good ages. Mine are 11, almost 16 and 18. And I don't know about your kids, probably better off, but I'm sure my kids are not unusual in that 2 of my 3 are very picky eaters, and not picky in a good way. Picky in a, I don't really like to eat anything that's healthy. And so I know that I am not alone in that challenge. I would assume you probably have clients that are not alone in that challenge too. And we probably have a number of people listening to this podcast who are parents or grandparents, et cetera, aunts, uncles that maybe see the same thing. Do you have any advice or suggestions for how to be able to turn that tide in a society where we feed our children pizza, mac and cheese, chicken nuggets? Again, no judgment. I do the same because sometimes it just is what it is. But what I know is if I had learned these health lessons far earlier in life, I would have been far healthier and had far better energy. And my body wouldn't have needed as much repair as it needed to be able to overcome those things. So do you have any advice for how to do that with the younger generation?
Yes, I love this question. And actually, my oldest is an extremely picky eater. He has taught me more about food and how to work through some of the struggles than any of my clients ever have. There is actually an eating disorder called ARFID, Avoidant and Restrictive Feeding Intake Disorder. And it has nothing to do with body image. It actually has everything to do with textures and how you perceive the food you eat. And my son's never been clinically diagnosed, but he checks all the boxes. And I share this because I think a lot of us do have picky eaters, and so there's a spectrum of this ARFID diagnosis. And sometimes it's very clear and it's very restrictive, but sometimes it's just these restrictive tendencies. And one of the things kids are is they're very intuitive. And if something doesn't feel good to them, they're going to not want to do it. And so, for example, my son, we tried to give him pasta and he told me it was worms in his mouth. Like he couldn't. And the poor kid, he was like truly like very distressed about it. And I'm looking at him going like, I'm not going to try to convince him to eat pasta. This is a terrible experience for him. So I share all that because I think, we as parents have a lot of pressure to feed our kids right and to not mess them up. And one of the things I've really found is this balance of guiding them and giving them direction as to how to take care of their body. My sweet boy, you need protein to build muscles. You need carbohydrate to keep energy. And we need fruits and veggies so you can grow tall and smart. And we got to balance sugar so that your body doesn't get out like all wonky is what we call it. And, we give that guidance. And at the same time, we trust that bodies are resilient and we don't have to be perfect. And so, Blake, you are not alone. Because of what, his conditions and his struggles, he is a mac and cheese, chicken nugget kind of boy. But you know what? We balance it with, I feed him what I call candy juice, which is actually like blended pineapple, spinach, a little bit of flaxseed and some water. We call it candy juice, but he'll have chicken nuggets or pizza with some candy juice. And we do believe in adding supplements as a safety blanket, but I do trust that his body is resilient. I also trust in the model my husband and I are setting. We believe in family dinners. We believe in connection over food, and we are modeling taking care of our bodies. So my job as a parent with him right now is to make sure his base nutrition needs are met, which we're doing. We're feeding him adequately. We are, number two, creating an enjoyable experience around food where we are connecting over food. We're tasting food. We're talking about what it does in our body, and we're trusting that he's going to be okay in the process.
I love that you've nicknamed it candy juice. That just makes me smile so much. And thank you for giving us the recipe, right? For those of you, maybe this is worth trying. It's funny about older sister. And I remember she's just really smart about being able to figure out ways to get kids to do things that they might not. And I remember, I don't know why this comes up, but it makes me laugh because it's a similar type of thing. When my kids were little and her kids were little, they wouldn't want to go to the bathroom. And so she would just say, let's go take a test pee-pee. Let's go take a test pee-pee and see if there's anything there. And it's the same energy to me of the candy juice, right? It's like, how can I take this thing that's important for you to do and just bring some like joy or fun to it where it feels light and easy? And how different might things be if we had grown up that way around food, where it's like, yeah, you can have this thing and then we're going to do this other thing that's fun. Because I think often, again, it goes back to the conditioning, right? So many old stories, you have to eat everything on your plate. I remember as a young child, my dad served us liver and onions. And when I mean young, I mean like kindergarten. And I did not want to eat it. Yeah, nasty. I did not want to eat it. And I remember, and I don't know how long it was because, time to a child is not the same. But I remember him having me stay at the dinner table. And we used to have this song, you don't get a treat until you eat your meat.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And there's these things, right, that I think as parents we do, trying to do what's good for our children without any understanding of what might the downward consequences of some of those things be. And that's why when we started this conversation, it's like, I don't care who you are, you, as by nature of just being human, there are belief systems that you have around food based on how your family grew up that may or may not be serving you anymore. And the cool part is, to what you're sharing, Jess, is you can choose what you want it to be now. And you can choose what you model. And you can choose to learn new things. And you can also look at intuitively, what is my body telling me? And how do I trust myself versus looking externally at all of these other things people are doing and assuming that's right for me? And I just love that message in so many ways, because I often say that life is always teaching you lessons. Are you listening? Our bodies are always teaching us lessons, and they're telling us when things are off and not okay. And one of the most heartbreaking things, I think, for me in the last 6 years doing the work that I do is the number of clients I've worked with who've ended up with cancer or all these other problems and were shocked by it. But I can guarantee you that their body was telling them stuff for a really long time before that. But because they were so disassociated, hadn't learned to trust their body, or didn't even know or take the time, often because we're overthinking and overscheduled, to be able to see what was right in front of them.
Yeah.
And so for whoever is sitting here, if you're sitting with health issues, if you don't have some of the foundational basics that Jess has said, it can be just as simple as starting with that today. Like, that's it. What happens if you give yourself adequate water? What happens if you give yourself adequate food and veggies? How do you feel? And if you could just start with something as simple as that and changing that habit and then reassessing, what I often see is we start to gain momentum, because the energy that we're lacking starts building, and then it becomes easier and easier to stay consistent and implement new things that can create even better health for ourselves.
So good. Yeah. When you were talking, it just reminded me of the story of my son. I was taking my boys through Chick-fil-A and they asked for a milkshake. And I said, sure, we can have a milkshake today. It was a special day. So I got him a milkshake. And normally what I do is I make them split the milkshake. And they were younger. I think they were like gosh, I don't know. The baby was old enough to fall asleep in the car. Like we were still in that phase, you know? So I order the food and then I turn around and my baby's asleep and the older one is awake. And so he's like, Mama, milkshake. You know, he's like, can I have it? So I'm like, okay, yes, here you go. And I hand it to him while I'm doing my thing driving. All of a sudden I turn around. That kid had chugged the entire milkshake. And I was like, oh, and he looks at me and he goes, Mama, I do not feel good. And, you know, I decided to make this a real teaching moment because I could have said, see, this is why we don't drink all the milkshakes. You know, this is why Mama makes you split it. But instead I said, tell me more. And I let him tell me. And it was really interesting to hear his perception. You know, he was able to describe to me, Mama, my stomach feels like it's pushing in a different direction. And I feel like my head is saying that was a bad idea. And it was just really sweet to see, you know, he didn't have shame. He doesn't have the shame that's imposed on our culture of making a right or wrong decision with food. He was just genuinely in his body and able to hear his body say that was too much. And so I said, okay, baby boy, what do you think we should do? He goes, I think I definitely need some water. And I think I need to not do that again. Next time, will you put it in 2 cups so I don't drink the whole thing? And so to this day, when we go to Chick-fil-A, if he asks for a milkshake, he's like, Mama, can you make sure they put it in a 2nd cup? Because he remembers that experience. And I think if more of us could, you know, like to your point, stay connected, our body is telling us. We just have to slow down enough. We have to step out of shame, not let shame get to us, hear what it's saying. And then we have a lot of great biofeedback to make decisions going forward.
I love that. There's really honestly nothing else I could add. It's almost the perfect way to end, except that I'm going to give you the last question, which I always give everyone who has come, which is, Jess, is there anything that I haven't asked you that I should have? Or just anything else on your heart that you really want to share as we wrap up?
I guess just one more piece to that story, because, you know, it was such a great experience for him and his body was okay too. And I think it's, in other words, like he had the milkshake, his blood sugar was high. He didn't feel good for a few hours. But because he listened and we adjusted, like his blood sugar came back down, his body was resilient. So it's this beautiful balance of, if we can listen to our body and trust it to handle some of the mistakes that we might make with food, we can come to this very like peaceful, easy flowing experience with food. We don't have to get so caught up in doing it perfectly or doing it exactly right. We can actually just go through life, try it, see how it works out, listen, and then we have more information to go forward. So I would just add that piece of like, you're not going to get it right every time. You know, there are things I'm sure we're all doing with food or anything really that isn't serving our bodies. But if we do listen and we stay out of shame, our body can handle it and it can move on and we can do the next right thing.
So good. Jess, for those of the listeners here that would love to connect with you, how can they do so?
Awesome. Thank you. So I actually host a podcast. It's called Fuel Her Awesome, where we do talk about the empowered eating method and how to build that within your own life. So they can find me over there. And then I also have a free empowered eating workshop where I talk about how we uncomplicate food so that you can eat intuitively and hit some of the goals that you might have in your health journey. And that can be found over at jessbrownrd.com.
Thank you so much, Jess. What a fun conversation today. I feel like we covered, 30 different topics. And yet at the heart of it, what I really see is a focus on learning to trust yourself, what your body is saying, and to be able to let go of or not create shame or guilt around how you're living your life or the decisions that you make. And I think that's so powerful in so many ways, obviously from a nutrition standpoint, but just life in general. So thank you for coming on and sharing your wisdom.
Thank you so much for having me, Blake.
And for those of you guys listening, thanks so much for being here. And until next time, have a great week.